Hello, my name is Brandon Smith. I work with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service with the National Soil Health Division. Today, I'm talking about the Soil Carbon Amendment Interim Conservation Practice Standard. This was something I wrote last year and has been adopted by a number of states. And so basically, the reason why I'm talking about this standard today as it relates to water quality is we know that when you improve soil organic carbon, which I tend to interchange a lot with soil organic matter, when you improve soil organic matter, you tend to see improved soil function. And with improved soil function, you tend to see improvement in water quality and a number of other physical properties in the soil. So we know that there are multiple methods to increase soil organic matter. That's for sure. We tend to promote the 4 principles of soil health in our division. Corey already talked about those: minimizing disturbance, maximizing soil cover, biodiversity, and living roots. And these are really critical long-term management objectives. Those are really the mechanisms that we need to focus on to improve soil health, keeping in mind that nothing is a silver bullet. We always need to adapt, monitor, and evaluate. These are management goals for a particular land unit, for a particular situation with a particular farmer. So it involves management. There is no template, there is no recipe for soil health. So with that said, there are also ways to get shorter term gains in soil health. And the addition of soil conditioners, which I'll call them, they tend to give you I guess I would say, a jump start in soil health. And these common conditioners are compost and biochar. There's a lot of research out there on the impact of these soil conditioners on soil function. Let's just take biochar, for example. On the right here, we showed different types of biochar made from different sources of feedstock. And if you do a literature review, you see that there's a lot of research on compost and biochar and how they affect soil properties. Here's just one example from Umberto Blanco-Kenke's work. He looked at biochar and how it affects soil physical properties and water quality. And well, biochar does a lot of good things for the soil. It can reduce bulk density, increase porosity and infiltration, improve wet aggregate stability, reduce runoff and erosion, reduces nitrogen leaching. Some of these percentages of reduction or improvement are pretty significant. One of the things that is still up in the air, though, is how biochar affects phosphorus movement. And so, again, though, it's got to be site specific how you deal with improving soil health. So you have to take into consideration a number of factors, because biochar on its own is not a silver bullet either. So I just want to talk about NRCS and our conservation practices. If you are not really familiar with us, the conservation practices are used as guides or standards to help our staff, help our producers treat resource concerns. So right now we have 47 resource concerns in the agency. And so these are issues that you'll find out on the landscape that you'll want to try to help producers improve or address. And so there are soil health resource concerns. So just to give you a glimpse, organic matter depletion is a relatively common one. So is compaction, right? And 2 new ones this year were aggregate instability and soil organism habitat loss or degradation. So we're happy to have those 2 new resource concerns, and I think the idea that we can really help try to address soil biology and soil aggregation as part of our technical and financial assistance, I think that's really key. And so we use these standards to provide that assistance, and then we use interim practices really as a way to help evaluate what we're calling, quote, new conservation technology. So even though you could say compost and biochar are actually not new at all, which they aren't, the idea is, how do they fit within NRCS and our planning process? And so the goal of the interim practices then is to evaluate them over a 3-year period. And then at the end of those 3-year period, we can decide whether it will be permanent practice or whether we want to abandon it. And it's up to the states to decide whether they want to adopt an interim or not. So typically the state conservationist meets with the state technical committee, and based on input from the state technical committee, the state conservationist then makes a decision about whether to adopt an interim or not. So a bit more details about our soil carbon amendment interim. The definition was not so easy to come by because we really wanted to limit it to organic carbon sources, but there's, some confusion between the National Organic Program and what it means to be an organic amendment. And so we tried to remove the word organic from the definition without diluting what we wanted to mean. And so basically we're saying using amendments derived from plant or animal residues that will improve the physical, chemical, and biological properties of the soil. And the purposes why we do this, they basically relate to those resource concerns that I talked about on the previous slide. So to improve soil organic matter, improve soil aggregate stability, organism habitat, plant productivity, irrigation water use, moisture management. And so this was actually introduced a year ago, and there were a few states that adopted it last year. Not many were able to put it on the ground just because we had to wait for some Farm Bill related rules to be done before we could actually implement it. So this year is really the first year, this fiscal year 21 is really the first year that we're really got going with this practice. 19 or 20 states have adopted it. You can see the list of the states below and the areas as well. And, this is probably double the states that showed interest last year. So it's a nice representation now across the country. And so we'll work with these states to try to get it fine-tuned, get this practice fine-tuned and see how it works within NRCS. And so I talked about this before. We want it to be organic carbon sources. The idea here is that it really applies to all land uses. So these are all land uses, whether it be cropland, pasture, it could even be forest land, right? Situations where the soil is in need of improvement. And, of course, there are exceptions. We want to make sure it's not applied to native grasslands, right? And with range, we want to make sure with rangeland, we want to make sure that the plant community dynamics are not negatively impacted by the application of a material. So we've got to be careful there for sure. We also want to make sure that we don't apply it to fallow land. We want to make sure that the nutrients are actually going to be used. The nutrients in these amendments will be used and that we're not actually creating a resource concern. We did limit it to the organic carbon sources, so it does not apply to limestone. But some of the ones we ruled out, though, were biosolids and sludge. And then we also excluded raw animal manure. So composted animal manure or manure made into biochar is perfectly fine. We just didn't want to cross any lines with, quote, paying for people to spread manure as part of their regular operations. So that's why that says that. But really, when it comes down to it, we're really talking about mostly biochar and compost. Now, the door is open for states to evaluate other materials, whether it's wood chips, pulverized paper, sugar beet pulp, distillation residue. So there are a number of other things that this can be used for. Here are the scenarios that we've come up with. So scenarios are basically how we define parameters for financial assistance. And so it's up to states too. They can choose one or more of these scenarios. If they adopt the practice, they have to choose at least one scenario, but they can choose whichever ones they want. And so just briefly, what we've tried to do is, because we're providing financial assistance, we want to put some lower thresholds on the application. So to make sure that we're at least getting something for the taxpayers' money that we're investing into this particular practice. So we have what we're calling a low rate scenarios. There's two of them, whether the compost is made some off-site and then brought onto the farm, or whether it's produced on farm. And so the minimum threshold here is 1 ton per acre. And that's not a lot at all, right? Really, the goal here is that's what we're going to pay for with this scenario. And part of the goal is just to help inoculate or give a boost to soil organisms by providing improved habitat and actually increased diversity of soil organisms as well. Our next rate is what we're calling a moderate rate, and that has a lower threshold or a floor of 3 tons per acre. And still, that is not a lot when it comes to compost. However, that is just a different tier, if you will, of what we want to provide financial assistance for. And then we have two biochar related scenarios. Both of the biochar scenarios, they have to be imported, so they have to be produced by someone or by an entity that is able to produce them in a high quality way. So we don't want right now we're not doing on-farm biochar application at this point in time. There is a CSP enhancement for that, but this is something different. So our floor or our threshold on biochar is either more than 1 ton per acre or 4 cubic yards per acre. Biochar is very hygroscopic, so it can, the weight of it can change a lot depending on the moisture conditions. So it's most easily quantified using a volume basis. And then we have a mixture of compost and biochar. This tends to be the most favorable situation, I think. You have some amount of biochar that's got this really stable carbon in it. And then you can inoculate it or charge it with some compost, and the blend of the two tends to be synergistic. And so we put some ratios and floors in there for what's required for the compost and biochar as well. And then the last two, carbon byproduct we talked about, that basically just provides financial assistance for trucking and spreading of a material. It assumes that the byproduct is free. So that actually is turning out to be a relatively popular one as well. And then the last one is more or less California site specific, basically in orchards that have reached the end of their lifespan, rather than cutting the trees and removing them from the orchard and burning them or other energy intensive techniques. The idea here is that you grind or chip the trees on site. They actually have machines that'll do this whole grinding and incorporation in one pass. And then the idea here is that you're just keeping that carbon on the farm. So there is a monitoring and evaluation component to this standard. We do have a number of criteria in the actual practice that we ask for. There are, of course, nutrient values, carbon values need to be reported. We need to make sure we know where the feedstock came from, what the feedstock is. And then we want to make sure that we have enough information in order to come up with a reasonably sound application plan for the producer. And so prior to application, we ask that our staff go out in the field and do a qualitative assessment of soil health. So looking at those resource concerns that I talked about earlier, and whether it's cropland, pasture, range, we have a number of these assessments within NRCS to help our staff diagnose any sort of resource concerns. And then we also ask for a laboratory soil health test. Our, quote, basic NRCS soil health test involves testing for aggregate stability, respiration, bioavailable nitrogen, organic carbon, of course. This one makes sense for this particular standard. And then active carbon as well, that labile fraction of carbon available in the soil. So we ask for those two things prior to application, and then we ask for some follow-up testing 2 or 3 years down the road to see what the impact of these applications has had. And then once we get to that 3-year period, we'll decide whether to make it a permanent practice or not. And right now we've got a second draft of the standard going, and we will reevaluate it for this coming year. I'm always open for any sort of input on the practice itself and willing to talk about this with just about anyone. So I appreciate your time, and happy to take any questions or follow up at any point in time. Thank you.